You know, what happens when just one person decides to take on an entire empire? Well, today we're diving into a landmark legal battle from the 18th century. It all hinged on a tax, a promise, and what might just be one of the most important administrative screw-ups in history. This is the story of Campbell versus Hall.
So let's get right to it. Here's the big question at the heart of this whole thing. Can a king, all by himself, just create a new tax for people in a territory he just conquered? And we're not just talking theory here. This was about real people, real money, and some really fundamental rights.
All right, let's meet the main characters. In one corner, you've got James Campbell. He's a British citizen who's just set up a plantation on the island of Grenada. And in the other corner is William Hall, the guy sent to collect the king's taxes. But let's be real, Hall's just the face of the operation. Campbell's real fight, that was with King George III himself.
So how did this whole thing even start? Well, like so many stories in history, it all kicked off with a brand new tax.
And this was the number that caused all the trouble, 4.5%. The king had ordered a new duty, a new tax, on all goods and sugar being shipped out of Grenada. Now, Grenada was a new prize for Britain, just one from France. And the idea was pretty simple, really. Just get Grenada on the same tax page as the other British sugar colonies.
Okay, now here is where it gets super interesting. Campbell actually went ahead and paid the tax to Hall. But then he immediately turned around and sued Hall to get his money back. Why? He argued the tax was totally illegal. The whole thing was what they call a test case. Believe it or not, even the government was in on it because they all wanted the court to finally settle the question. Did the king have the right to do this, or had he gone too far?
And that question forced the court to stare down a massive constitutional issue. Just how much power does a king really have over a land he's conquered? What are the limits?
So the king's lawyers made their case. They said his authority came from something called the royal prerogative. Now this is basically the set of special powers that belong only to the monarch, stuff they can do without needing a permission slip from Parliament. And their argument was that for a conquered territory, this prerogative absolutely included the power to make new laws. And yep, that included new taxes. The judge in this case was the legendary Lord Mansfield, and he started by laying out 6 ground rules about conquest that pretty much everyone agreed on. You know, things like a conquered country belongs to the king, its people become his subjects, and their old laws stick around until the new ruler changes them. And honestly, looking at these rules, it really seems like the king's got a slam-dunk case for imposing his tax.
And here's the kicker. To back it all up, Lord Mansfield points to this major legal precedent, Calving's case, which basically says, yeah, a king who conquers a kingdom can absolutely change its laws. At this point, if you're a betting person, you're putting all your money on the crown. Things are looking really, really good for the king.
But just when it looked like it was all over, Campbell's lawyers played their ace. They introduced a piece of evidence that changed everything. The argument wasn't about the king's general power anymore. It was about a very specific promise he had already made.
And here it is, the smoking gun. It's a royal proclamation from the king himself. In it, he was trying to encourage British folks to move to Grenada, and to do that, he promised them their own local government, a legislative assembly, with the power to, and I'm quoting here, make, constitute, and ordain laws. He was literally promising them the right to make their own laws.
The timing here, as you can see, is absolutely critical. So look, in February of 1763, Great Britain officially gets Grenada. Then in October, the king makes his big promise of a local assembly. But it's only after that, way later in July 1764, that he tries to slap on the tax using his own power. The promise came first. That changes everything. So, the court was stuck. On one hand, you have the king's inherent power as a conqueror. On the other, you have the king's very public promise. Which one wins? It was time for a decision. So, it really all boiled down to this. The king's argument was simple. I conquered this land, I have the power to tax it. End of story. But Campbell's argument was much sharper. It was, sure, maybe you had that power once, but when you promised us an assembly to make our own laws, you gave that power away. You can't have it both ways.
And then the decision came down, and it was an absolute shocker. Judgment for the plaintiff. James Campbell won. The king lost. The court ordered Campbell to get his money back and declared the tax completely void.
So you have to be asking, why? How on earth did a regular planner beat the king, who seemed to have all the power on his side? Well, the reason is actually pretty simple, but it's also incredibly profound.
Now, here's the twist you didn't see coming. Lord Mansfield actually agreed that the king did have the power to impose the tax. He totally could have done it right after the conquest. No one would have blinked an eye. The problem wasn't that he lacked the power. The problem was his timing was terrible. He just waited too long. As Lord Mansfield himself put it, when the king issued that proclamation, he made an immediate and irrecoverable grant of power to a future assembly. Basically, once that promise was made public, it was out there. He couldn't just take it back. It was a done deal.
And this might be the most incredible part of the whole story. The court basically called it a clerical error, the inattention of the king's servants. Just think about that. If the king's officials had just issued the tax order before they issued the proclamation promising an assembly, the tax would have been perfectly fine and legal. But they messed up the order of the paperwork, and because of that bureaucratic blunder, the whole thing got thrown out.
Okay, so a 250-year-old case about sugar taxes that was decided because someone filed the wrong form first. Why should we care about this today? Well, because the principles this case laid down are absolutely fundamental to how we think about government power.
This case hammered home a few huge ideas. One, that executive power isn't infinite. It has limits. Two, it showed that the rule of law applies to everyone, even the king. And maybe most importantly, it established this powerful precedent. When a government gives the people a constitutional right, like the right to representation, it can't just be taken back on a whim. That promise is irrevocable. And that leaves us with a question from this centuries-old case that is just as important now as it was then. It's a question about trust and about the power of a promise. When a government makes a solemn pledge to its people, at what point does that promise become permanent? At what point can it never, ever be taken back?